Imagine the most powerful queen of Spain, the one who united the kingdoms and funded Columbus' expedition, making a vow that turned her body into a living symbol of sacrifice and fear. Isabella of Castile swore not to change her underwear until the final stage of the Reconquista was completed. But what lies behind this sacred vow? How did an obsession with purity and spirituality lead her to a condition that made the court and her attendants hold their breath? This is not fiction, but a hidden truth, desperately covered by the official legend. Watch as her devotion to her oath destroyed her body, leaving only remnants of her once mighty reign. Isabella of Castile was 31 years old in 1482 when she made a decision that would transform her body into a living monument to religious obsession. She had been Queen of Castile for 8 years, ruling alongside her husband Ferdinand of Aragon in what would eventually become a unified Spain. Together, they were pursuing the Reconquista, a military and religious campaign that had been ongoing for nearly 8 centuries. The goal was simple but monumental: drive Muslim rulers completely out of the Iberian Peninsula and restore Christian control over lands that had been contested since the 8th century. By 1482, only one Muslim stronghold remained. The Emirate of Granada, nestled in the mountains of southern Spain, was the last piece of territory that needed to be conquered before the Reconquista could be declared complete. Isabella saw this final campaign not just as a military necessity but as a holy mission. She was deeply, genuinely devout in ways that shaped every aspect of her rule. Her faith wasn't performative or political, it was the core of her identity, and she believed absolutely that God had chosen her to complete the centuries-long work of reclaiming Spain for Christianity. So when she stood before an assembly of nobles, clergy, and military commanders to announce the final push against Granada, she wanted to make a gesture that would demonstrate the depth of her commitment. She swore an oath before the Virgin Mary and everyone present that she would not change her undergarment, the linen camise worn closest to her skin, until Granada fell to Christian forces. It was meant as a symbol of sacrifice, a way of showing that she would endure any discomfort to secure God's favor in the coming war. To understand why this seemed like a reasonable vow at the time, you have to understand medieval concepts of piety and sacrifice. Religious devotion often involved deliberate physical discomfort. Monks wore rough hair shirts that irritated their skin. Pilgrims walked barefoot over long distances. Fasting until you felt weak was considered holy. The idea was that suffering brought you closer to God, that it proved your faith was stronger than your desire for comfort. Isabella's vow fit perfectly into this tradition. She was promising to endure the minor inconvenience of wearing the same undergarment until victory was achieved, demonstrating that earthly comfort meant nothing compared to spiritual mission. Her courtiers understood this immediately. They saw it as a dramatic but appropriate gesture from a queen known for her intense faith. What nobody anticipated was how long the campaign would actually take. Military leaders assumed Granada would fall within months, perhaps a year at most. The emirate was surrounded, outnumbered, and increasingly isolated from any potential allies who might send reinforcements. A quick siege, maybe one major battle, and Christian forces would be marching through Granada's gates in triumph. Isabella would endure a few uncomfortable weeks, maybe a season of wearing the same linen, and then her vow would be fulfilled and everyone could celebrate. Except that's not what happened. Granada's rulers proved to be skilled military tacticians. The mountainous terrain favored defensive warfare. The city's fortifications were stronger than anyone had expected. What should have been a quick conquest turned into a grinding, exhausting siege that would stretch across nearly a decade. And through all those years, Isabella refused to break her vow. The linen camise that had been clean and white when she first put it on stayed pressed against her skin through summer heat and winter cold. It absorbed her sweat during the day and moisture from her body at night. It collected blood during her menstrual cycles. It soaked up the natural oils and secretions that human skin produces constantly. And because it was never washed, never changed, never given any opportunity to dry out completely, all of that accumulated filth stayed trapped against her body. The fabric began to darken from white to yellow to brown. It started to stiffen as dried fluids hardened the fibers. And most importantly, it became a breeding ground for bacteria that would slowly transform Isabella's body into a mass of infected, rotting tissue. The changes started gradually enough that they could be ignored or explained away at first. Isabella's servants noticed that the undergarment had become discolored when they helped her dress each morning. They saw that it stuck to her skin in places where moisture had made it adhere. They caught faint whiffs of an unpleasant smell that seemed to come from the queen herself rather than from her surroundings. But nobody said anything, because the vow was sacred and questioning it would be questioning Isabella's faith. The queen herself felt increasing discomfort as months turned into years. The fabric chafed against her skin when she moved. It felt rough and irritating rather than soft. But she interpreted this discomfort as exactly what she'd signed up for, the sacrifice she'd promised to make, and she endured it without complaint because that was the entire point of the vow. By 1484, 2 years into her vow, Isabella's body had begun developing serious problems that couldn't be dismissed as mere discomfort. The constant presence of dirty, bacteria-laden fabric against her skin was causing exactly the kind of damage that happens when wounds can't heal properly. Her skin, which naturally sheds dead cells and repairs minor damage constantly, couldn't complete these processes because the filthy cloth prevented proper healing. Small areas of chafing where the rough fabric rubbed against her became raw spots. Those raw spots became open sores. The sores became infected because they were constantly in contact with cloth that was basically a culture medium for harmful bacteria. And because the cloth was never removed, the infections had no opportunity to heal. They just spread slowly from one area to another, creating ever larger patches of damaged, painful tissue. The smell that had been faint and easily ignored 2 years earlier was now strong enough that people standing near Isabella could detect it clearly. It wasn't the normal smell of unwashed clothing or body odor, though those were certainly present. It was the distinctive sweet, rotten odor of infected tissue, the smell of flesh that's breaking down because bacteria are consuming it faster than the body can repair the damage. Isabella's servants tried to mask this smell with heavy applications of perfume. They burned incense constantly in her chambers. They made sure that whenever she appeared in public, there were flowers and scented oils nearby to cover the odor. But there's only so much perfume can accomplish when the source of the smell is literally rotting skin pressed against infected fabric. The courtiers and nobles who attended Isabella learned to adapt to her condition without ever acknowledging it openly. When they had audiences with the queen, they positioned themselves carefully to stay upwind if possible. They pressed scented handkerchiefs discreetly to their noses. They kept their expressions neutral and respectful even when the smell became overwhelming. Foreign ambassadors visiting the Spanish court noticed something was wrong but couldn't quite identify what it was. They wrote letters home describing the strange atmosphere at Castilian palaces, mentioning an unpleasant odor they couldn't explain and a sense that something wasn't right with the queen's health, though she continued performing all her duties and showed no obvious signs of serious illness beyond looking pale and moving somewhat stiffly. What was actually happening to Isabella's body was horrifying in its systematic progression. The infections that had started as isolated sores were spreading and connecting. Large areas of her back, sides, and thighs were now covered in damaged tissue that oozed pus constantly. The linen camise, which had once been a separate piece of clothing, was becoming physically fused to her skin in places where the infected tissue had essentially grown around the fabric fibers. This happens when wounds try to heal while foreign material is embedded in them. The body attempts to close over whatever's present, incorporating it into new tissue growth. In Isabella's case, this meant that removing the camise would eventually require literally tearing fabric out of her flesh, but nobody knew this yet because the garment had never been removed since she made her vow. The physical pain Isabella experienced daily was intense and unrelenting. Every movement caused infected skin to rub against rough fabric, triggering fresh waves of burning pain. Sitting down pressed the infected areas against hard surfaces, which was agonizing. Walking made the cloth shift and chafe. Even lying still at night wasn't comfortable because any change in position meant disturbed wounds and renewed pain. Sleep became difficult and irregular, which meant Isabella was constantly exhausted on top of being in constant pain. This combination of chronic pain and sleep deprivation started affecting her mentally as well as physically. Her thinking became less flexible. Her mood grew darker. Small irritations provoked disproportionate anger. She had less patience with advisors who questioned her decisions. Her already intense faith became more rigid and severe. Isabella's doctors examined her as best they could without removing the camise, which meant they couldn't actually see or properly treat the worst of the damage. They prescribed herbal remedies that were supposed to purify the blood and balance the humors, following medieval medical theory that had no understanding of bacterial infection or how to treat it effectively. They recommended dietary changes and bleeding sessions and various other treatments that accomplished nothing because the real problem was the filthy, bacteria-soaked cloth that remained pressed against her skin day and night. The physicians knew something was seriously wrong with their queen's health, but they couldn't treat it without violating her sacred vow, so they treated symptoms ineffectively while watching her condition slowly worsen. By 1487, 5 years into her vow, Isabella had become a fundamentally different person than she'd been when she started. The chronic pain, the constant exhaustion from poor sleep, the low-grade fever her body maintained trying to fight off overwhelming infection, all of these had worn away at her personality and judgment. Her faith, which had always been strong, had hardened into something inflexible and unforgiving. She saw the world increasingly in terms of purity and contamination, righteousness and sin, with no room for nuance or mercy. This wasn't just a personality change, it was a direct result of what her body was experiencing. Years of suffering had convinced her that suffering itself was holy, that pain was proof of devotion, that anyone who avoided discomfort was spiritually weak. This shift in Isabella's thinking had immediate consequences for how she governed. Her decisions became harsher. Her treatment of enemies grew more severe. The Spanish Inquisition, which had been established earlier in her reign to ensure religious orthodoxy, received more support and broader powers. People accused of heresy faced not just investigation but torture and execution. Isabella attended these proceedings personally, viewing them not as cruelty but as necessary purification. Just as her body was being purified through suffering, she believed Spain itself needed to be purified through the elimination of anyone whose faith was questionable. The parallel between her physical state and her policy decisions was exact and terrible. The siege of Granada continued grinding forward through these years, making painfully slow progress. Isabella insisted on being present at military encampments near the fighting, living in conditions that would have been harsh for healthy soldiers and were absolutely brutal for a woman whose body was already failing from infection. The field camps offered none of the comforts of palace life. Sanitation was poor. Food was rough and often spoiled. The weather was either too hot or too cold. For Isabella, dealing with infected skin that covered large portions of her body, these conditions were catastrophic. The dirt and sweat and poor hygiene of military camp life added new layers of contamination to wounds that were already severely infected. Soldiers who saw Isabella during this period were shocked by her appearance and spread stories that quickly became legends. They said her skin had turned grayish and looked like it was rotting. They claimed she bled black instead of red. They whispered that insects crawled beneath her clothing, attracted by the smell of decay. These stories were exaggerated, but they weren't entirely wrong. Isabella did look like someone who was dying slowly. Her face had become gaunt, almost skeletal. Her eyes had sunken into dark hollows. Her movements were stiff and painful. She looked like a walking corpse, animated only by willpower and fanatic devotion to completing the Reconquista. Cardinal Mendoza, Isabella's personal confessor and one of the few people who could speak to her with any honesty, became increasingly alarmed by what he observed. He could see that the Queen's physical suffering was destroying her mentally and spiritually as well as physically. Her prayers had become obsessive, the same phrases repeated hundreds of times with mechanical precision. Her religious observances consumed hours each day and had to be performed with exact ritual correctness or she would start over from the beginning. Her thinking about sin and punishment had become rigid to the point of cruelty. Mendoza wanted to intervene, wanted to suggest that perhaps the vow had been fulfilled sufficiently and she should end this self-destruction before it was too late. But he knew that any such suggestion would be rejected violently as a temptation from Satan, so he stayed silent and watched his queen slowly fall apart. The years between 1487 and 1491 saw Isabella's condition continue its relentless deterioration. More skin died and turned necrotic. More infections spread through tissue that should have been healthy. The smell became so powerful that prolonged proximity to the queen was almost unbearable. Her servants developed elaborate protocols for managing her condition. They worked in shifts because nobody could endure being near her for extended periods. They covered their noses and mouths with cloth soaked in strong perfumes. They breathed through their mouths to reduce how much of the smell they inhaled. And still, several of Isabella's attendants developed their own health problems from handling her contaminated clothing and being exposed to whatever bacteria were thriving in her infections. January of 1492 finally brought the end of the siege. After nearly 10 years of grinding warfare, Granada surrendered to Christian forces. The Reconquista was complete. Muslim rule in Iberia had ended. Isabella's vow could finally be fulfilled. But there was no triumphant public ceremony with the queen appearing in glory before cheering crowds. Instead, she was rushed immediately into private chambers where physicians could attempt what everyone understood would be an extremely difficult and dangerous medical procedure. After almost a decade, they were going to try to remove the linen camise that had become literally part of Isabella's body. What the physicians found when they began this process was worse than even they had anticipated, and these were men who had treated battlefield injuries and plague victims. The camise hadn't just stuck to Isabella's skin in a few places. Over large areas of her back, sides, and thighs, the fabric had actually fused into her flesh. Where infections had been worst, the body's attempts to heal had incorporated the fabric fibers into new tissue growth. Removing the garment meant cutting and tearing this fused tissue, which meant removing portions of Isabella's own skin along with the cloth. The physicians worked carefully, trying to minimize damage, but there was no way to do this gently. Each strip of fabric that came away took skin with it. Blood and thick pus poured from exposed wounds. The smell that filled the chamber was overwhelming, the concentrated stench of decay that had been building for nearly 10 years. Isabella remained mostly silent through hours of this agonizing procedure. Whether she was in shock, or maintained control through sheer willpower, or had progressed beyond the ability to express pain, nobody could say. Her body trembled violently. Sweat poured from her face. Her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. But she didn't scream or beg them to stop. When they finally finished and wrapped her in clean bandages, she had lost consciousness from the trauma. The physicians looked at each other with expressions that conveyed what they couldn't say aloud. They had done what they could, but whether Isabella would survive the massive infection and tissue damage they'd just exposed was entirely uncertain. For the next 3 days, Isabella hovered between life and death. Fever consumed her as her body tried to fight off the overwhelming bacterial load that had been accumulating for years. Her physicians changed bandages constantly as the wounds wept pus and blood. They applied every remedy their medical knowledge suggested, though 17th century medicine had no real treatments for the kind of massive systemic infection Isabella was experiencing. They could only try to keep her comfortable and hope that her body's natural defenses would somehow overcome the bacteria that had been multiplying unchecked in her tissues for a decade. Everyone who saw her during those days assumed she was dying. Arrangements were quietly made for what would happen when the queen passed away. But slowly, impossibly, Isabella began to improve. The fever broke after nearly a week. The wounds, now properly cleaned and bandaged, started showing signs of healing instead of continuing to rot. After 2 weeks, she could sit up in bed. After a month, she could walk short distances with assistance. After 3 months, she had recovered enough strength to resume some of her duties as queen, though she would never be truly healthy again. Large scars covered much of her torso where skin had been torn away with the camise. Her complexion remained unhealthy and pale. Her body had been permanently weakened in ways that would affect her for her remaining years. But she had survived, which she took as proof that God had accepted her sacrifice and blessed Spain with victory. What Isabella did immediately after recovering revealed how completely her decade of suffering had transformed her thinking. Still dealing with wounds that required daily cleaning and bandaging, still visibly weak from her ordeal, she issued the Alhambra Decree in March of 1492. This edict commanded all Jews in Spain to either convert to Christianity or leave the country within 4 months. It wasn't a suggestion or a negotiation. It was absolute. Convert or exile. Communities that had existed in Spain for over 1,000 years, that had contributed enormously to Spanish culture, science, and economy, were given 4 months to abandon either their faith or their homes. Families faced impossible choices. Some converted, though they would spend the rest of their lives under Inquisition suspicion of secretly maintaining Jewish practices. Others packed what they could carry and fled to North Africa, the Ottoman Empire, anywhere that would accept them. The decree displaced hundreds of thousands of people and destroyed communities that could never be rebuilt. The connection between Isabella's physical ordeal and this brutal policy wasn't coincidental or accidental. She had spent 10 years believing that her suffering was purifying her spiritually, that pain and sacrifice brought her closer to God. When that suffering finally ended with Granada's conquest, she immediately applied the same logic to Spain itself. Just as her body had been purified through agony, Spain would be purified through the expulsion of anyone who didn't fit her vision of religious orthodoxy. The parallel was exact. Her personal torment had become the model for national policy. Suffering wasn't just acceptable, it was necessary for achieving spiritual purity, and anyone who suggested otherwise was wrong. The wealth seized from expelled Jews and from people executed by the Inquisition flowed directly into the royal treasury. Isabella used this money to fund Christopher Columbus's expedition across the Atlantic, which sailed in August of 1492. The ships that would discover the Americas for Europe, that would lead to Spain's vast colonial empire and centuries of dominance, were financed by systematic religious persecution within Spain itself. The connection was direct and undeniable. Spain's imperial future was built on the destruction of its own diverse communities, and Isabella saw no contradiction in this because her decade of physical suffering had taught her that great achievements require great sacrifices, regardless of who has to make those sacrifices. The culture of the Spanish court changed fundamentally during and after Isabella's vow. Her example of suffering as proof of devotion became something nobles felt they needed to imitate. Public displays of religious self-mortification became common. Aristocrats wore hair shirts that left their skin raw and bleeding. They fasted to the point of dangerous malnutrition. They scourged themselves with whips during religious ceremonies, leaving blood on church floors. This wasn't private piety, it was competitive suffering, a court-wide performance where status came from visible proof of your willingness to endure pain for faith. The atmosphere became oppressive. Joy and laughter were viewed with suspicion as signs of insufficient devotion. Art and music focused exclusively on suffering and martyrdom rather than beauty or celebration. Isabella's daughter Joanna grew up in this environment, watching her mother's transformation from powerful queen to walking embodiment of suffering. The psychological impact was devastating. Joanna would eventually be known as Joanna the Mad, a woman who exhibited severe mental illness including hallucinations and paranoid delusions. Whether she inherited psychological disorders genetically or whether the trauma of her upbringing caused her breakdown is debatable. What's certain is that Isabella's legacy of suffering as sanctity poisoned the next generation. The lesson Joanna learned from her mother was that power required constant pain, that leadership meant sacrificing your body and mind, and this lesson destroyed her ability to function as queen when her turn came to rule. Isabella of Castile died in 1504 at age 53. The official cause was recorded vaguely as fever and fatigue, but the reality was that her body never fully recovered from the damage done during her decade-long vow. The wounds from removing the fused camise had left permanent scars and weakened tissue. Her immune system had been compromised by years of chronic infection. She suffered from recurring health problems throughout her final 12 years, each illness hitting harder than it would have in someone whose body hadn't been systematically damaged by self-inflicted suffering. The vow had shortened her life significantly, though no official record would state this directly. After her death, Isabella's story was carefully managed to fit the narrative that Spanish authorities wanted to promote. The vow was presented as an inspiring example of faith and devotion, proof that Isabella had been willing to sacrifice anything for the Reconquista. The horrifying reality of what that sacrifice actually involved, the decade of rotting flesh and spreading infection and constant agony, was downplayed or omitted entirely. Statues depicted her as serene and beautiful, not as the gaunt, scarred woman she actually became. Chronicles praised her holiness without mentioning that courtiers had gagged in her presence or that physicians had needed hours to peel infected cloth from her flesh. The sanitized version became the official history. Modern medical analysis of Isabella's case reveals what actually happened to her body during those 10 years. Bacterial infections, probably including multiple different species, colonized the constantly moist, nutrient-rich environment created by unwashed fabric against skin. These infections caused progressive tissue death and systemic illness. The symptoms described in historical accounts, the smell of decay, the darkened skin, the constant fever, all match what we'd expect from severe, untreated bacterial infections. Some medical historians suggest she may also have suffered from parasitic infections, as lice and other parasites would have thrived in the unwashed fabric. The combination would have been truly horrifying from a medical standpoint, and the fact that Isabella survived at all is remarkable testament to human resilience. The broader legacy of Isabella's vow extends beyond her personal suffering to its impact on Spanish culture and policy. The decade she spent rotting in her own undergarment became symbolic of a particular approach to faith and governance, one that valued purity and orthodoxy over diversity and tolerance, that saw suffering as virtuous and mercy as weakness, that justified extreme measures including persecution and expulsion in the name of spiritual goals. This approach shaped Spain for centuries. The Inquisition continued operating into the 19th century. The cultural and intellectual vibrancy that had characterized medieval Spain, when Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars worked together, never recovered after the expulsions of the 1490s. The country that emerged from Isabella's reign was unified and Catholic and powerful, but it had achieved that unity by destroying the diversity that had been one of its greatest strengths. The queen who rotted in her vow left Spain transformed, but whether that transformation was ultimately positive or negative remains one of history's most debated questions.